There is a moment in the life of an empath that is difficult to explain to someone who has never experienced it. It is not necessarily a dramatic event. Sometimes nothing obvious happens at all. You simply begin to notice that you are experiencing the world differently. You walk into a room and immediately sense tension before anyone says a word. Someone tells you they are fine, but something in their voice tells you they are not. You can sit beside a person who is smiling while internally sensing sadness, anxiety, anger, or fear. And eventually, you begin asking yourself a strange question: why do I feel what everyone else is feeling? That question is where the first phase begins. The awakening of an empath is rarely about discovering that you have some supernatural ability. It is about becoming conscious of a pattern that has probably existed for years. You notice emotional details other people overlook: facial expressions, changes in tone, pauses between words, posture, silence, inconsistencies. Your attention naturally moves toward them. You are not simply listening to what someone says. You are constantly processing what their behavior is communicating underneath the words. And when you do that for long enough, you can become extremely accurate at reading people. But there is a psychological cost to being highly attuned to other people. If you do not understand where their emotions end and yours begin, empathy can become emotional confusion. You walk into a room where someone is angry, and suddenly you're angry. Someone is anxious, and you become restless. Someone is disappointed in you, and you immediately feel responsible. Someone withdraws from you, and your mind begins searching for what you did wrong. Notice the pattern. You are not simply experiencing emotion. You are assigning responsibility for that emotion to yourself. That is where sensitivity becomes dangerous. Because an empath can spend years believing that their purpose is to regulate everyone else's emotional environment. They become the peacemaker, the listener, the person everyone calls when things fall apart. They learn how to anticipate needs before those needs are spoken. They apologize quickly. They forgive repeatedly. They explain themselves endlessly. And because this behavior often receives positive reinforcement, it becomes part of their identity. People say, "You're such a caring person. You always understand me. I don't know what I'd do without you." Those statements sound like compliments, but psychologically, they can create a trap. The empath begins associating their worth with what they provide emotionally. They don't just want to be loved, they want to be useful enough that they cannot be abandoned. And that's a very different thing. This is why the awakening phase can be so confusing. The empath begins realizing that some of what they called kindness was actually fear. Some of what they called patience was actually avoidance of conflict. Some of what they called understanding was actually self-neglect. That realization hurts because it forces you to examine your own behavior without the comforting story attached to it. You begin asking, did I help this person because I genuinely wanted to, or because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't? That's a powerful question, because healthy empathy does not require self-destruction. You can understand someone's pain without becoming responsible for fixing it. You can recognize someone's trauma without allowing their trauma to become an excuse for how they treat you. You can care about someone deeply and still say no. This distinction is one of the most important psychological developments an empath can make. Empathy tells you what someone may be experiencing. Boundaries tell you what you are willing to do about it. Those are not the same thing. And once an empath understands that, their entire perception of relationships begins to change. They start noticing how often certain people come to them only when they need emotional support. They notice who respects their boundaries and who becomes angry when those boundaries appear. They notice who appreciates their presence and who simply appreciates their availability. And this is where awakening becomes uncomfortable. Because awareness does not just reveal the good in people, it reveals patterns. You begin seeing that some relationships survive because you kept sacrificing yourself to maintain them. You begin realizing that certain people did not necessarily love your authentic self. They loved the version of you that was endlessly understanding. That realization can feel like loss. But sometimes what feels like loss is actually the beginning of psychological freedom. The mature empath eventually understands that sensitivity was never the enemy. The problem was sensitivity without discernment. Your ability to feel deeply is not something you need to destroy. You need to learn how to direct it. You need to learn that every emotion you detect does not require your intervention. Every person you understand does not deserve unlimited access to you. Every wounded person is not your responsibility to heal. That is the first awakening. And once you see that clearly, you cannot comfortably return to the person you were before. Because awareness changes the way you see yourself. And once you understand the difference between empathy and self-abandonment, you begin preparing for the next phase, the moment when everything you once tolerated starts becoming impossible to tolerate. Your sensitivity is not your weakness, your lack of boundaries is. And this is where the second phase begins, and for many empaths, this is the hardest one. Because awakening is one thing, but knowing what you now know and actually changing your life because of it, that is something entirely different. There comes a point when the empath can no longer maintain the emotional system they built around everyone else. They have spent years understanding people, making excuses for them, giving second chances, absorbing their anger, explaining their behavior, and trying to preserve relationships that were slowly destroying their sense of self. And eventually, something breaks. Not necessarily in a dramatic way. Sometimes it is incredibly quiet. You stop answering immediately. You stop explaining. You stop chasing. You stop asking, what can I do to make this person feel better? And instead, you begin asking, what is happening to me in this relationship? That question changes everything, because for the first time, your attention moves away from managing other people's emotions and returns to your own internal experience. You begin noticing the exhaustion. You notice how tense you feel before certain people call. You notice how peaceful you become when they leave. You notice how often you have to convince yourself that something is acceptable when, deep down, you know it isn't. And this is where the empath encounters one of the most painful psychological truths. Understanding someone's behavior does not obligate you to tolerate it. You can understand why someone became emotionally unavailable. You can understand their childhood. You can understand their insecurities. You can understand their fear of abandonment, their anger, their trauma, their defenses. But understanding the origin of a behavior does not erase its consequences. That distinction is incredibly important because highly empathetic people often become so skilled at explaining other people's behavior that they accidentally become skilled at excusing it. They're hurting. They didn't mean it. They've been through a lot. They're just afraid. Maybe all of that is true. But the question remains, what is this relationship doing to you? This is the point where the empath begins to discover that compassion without boundaries can become self-abandonment. And that discovery can feel brutal. Because the empath may have built their identity around being the person who never gives up on anyone. So when they finally walk away, they may experience guilt. They may wonder if they're becoming selfish. They may feel cruel for protecting themselves. They may even miss people who repeatedly hurt them. That is because attachment does not disappear simply because awareness arrives. Your mind can understand that a relationship is unhealthy while another part of you still longs for the connection. That contradiction is normal, and it is one reason phase 2 hurts so much. You're not simply letting go of a person, you're letting go of a role. The rescuer, the fixer, the endlessly patient one. The person who believed that if they loved someone hard enough, understood them deeply enough, or remained loyal long enough, eventually that person would become capable of giving the same love back, but people do not change because you suffer beautifully for them. They change when they choose to change. And that realization can be devastating for someone who has spent years believing that their love could compensate for another person's unwillingness to grow. So the empath begins doing something unfamiliar. They allow consequences to exist. If someone is angry because you established a boundary, you don't immediately remove the boundary. If someone withdraws because you stopped overgiving, you don't chase them. If someone tries to make you feel guilty for protecting your peace, you don't automatically accept the guilt. You let their reaction belong to them. That's emotional maturity. And this is where silence becomes powerful, not silent treatment, not manipulation, not revenge, just the absence of unnecessary explanation. Because when you finally understand yourself, you no longer need everyone else to agree with your boundaries before you are allowed to have them. You realize that some people will misunderstand your growth. Some will call you cold, some will say you've changed, and they are right, you have changed. But change is not always a sign that something has gone wrong. Sometimes change is evidence that something has finally become clear. The empath in phase 2 learns that peace often requires disappointing people who benefited from their lack of boundaries. And that is painful. But there is another side to that pain. For the first time, you begin experiencing yourself without constantly monitoring everyone else's emotional state. You discover that you can sit in silence without fixing anything. You can say no without writing an essay explaining why. You can walk away without proving that the other person is a villain. You can love someone and still refuse to participate in a pattern that destroys you. That is the transformation happening underneath the pain. Phase 2 is not about becoming colder. It is about becoming more honest. Honest about what you feel. Honest about what you tolerate. Honest about who reciprocates. Honest about which relationships are built on mutual connection and which ones survive because you keep carrying them. And eventually, something remarkable happens. You stop asking, how do I make them understand my value? And you begin asking, why was I ever willing to abandon my own value to keep them? Whoa. That question marks the beginning of freedom. Sometimes the hardest person an empath has to stop rescuing is themselves. And after the breaking point, something unexpected begins to happen. The empath starts becoming whole again. Not the old version of whole, not the version that existed before the pain, when they believed being available to everyone was the same thing as being valuable. This is a different kind of wholeness. It comes from finally understanding that compassion and self-protection do not have to be opposites. This is the third phase, integration. And integration is important because healing is not simply becoming less sensitive. It is becoming more conscious of what you do with your sensitivity. Think about what happens when someone has spent years absorbing the emotional atmosphere around them. Eventually, they may start believing that peace means everyone around them must be happy. But that's impossible. Someone will always be disappointed. Someone will misunderstand you. Someone will disagree with your choices. Someone will want more from you than you are willing to give. And once you understand that, your definition of peace changes. Peace is no longer the absence of other people's discomfort. Peace becomes the ability to remain internally stable while other people experience their own emotions. That is a profound psychological shift. You stop treating another person's disappointment as an emergency. You stop assuming that someone's anger automatically means you've done something wrong. You stop interpreting someone's withdrawal as a command to chase them. And perhaps most importantly, you stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional truth. Just because you feel something strongly doesn't mean you are required to act on it immediately. An emotion is information. It is not always instruction. That distinction creates enormous freedom. The integrated empath still notices things. They still sense changes in tone. They still recognize tension. They still care when someone is hurting. But now there is a pause between perception and reaction. They can think, I notice that this person is upset. And then ask, is this mine to carry? That small question can completely change a person's life. Because mature empathy is not about absorbing everything, it is about discerning what belongs to you. You can listen without taking responsibility. You can support without rescuing. You can love without controlling. You can forgive without reopening the door. You can understand someone without giving them unlimited access to you. That is what emotional integration looks like. And something else happens during this phase. Your relationships become fewer in emotional demands, but greater in emotional quality. You begin valuing reciprocity. You notice who checks on you when you are struggling, who respects your no, who doesn't punish you for having boundaries, who can disagree without trying to destabilize you, who allows you to be a complete human being rather than expecting you to function as their therapist, rescuer, or emotional safety net. This is where discernment replaces hypervigilance. There's a difference. Hypervigilance says, I need to constantly monitor people because something bad might happen. Discernment says, I observe carefully and I trust myself to respond when necessary. One is fear, the other is wisdom. And this is why solitude can become such an important part of the third phase. Earlier in life, being alone may have felt like rejection. Now, it can feel like recovery. You begin discovering what your own mind sounds like when nobody else's emotions are dominating the room. You discover your preferences, your values, your standards, your ambitions, your sense of humor, your interests. You begin meeting yourself outside of the role you played for other people. And that can be surprisingly powerful because many empaths know how to understand everybody except themselves. They can explain why someone behaved badly. They can identify another person's insecurities. They can recognize emotional patterns from a mile away. But when asked, "What do you actually want?" they hesitate. Integration changes that. You become curious about yourself. You stop asking only, "What does everyone need from me?" and begin asking, "What do I need from myself?" That is not selfishness. That is psychological responsibility. Because if you continually abandon yourself in order to maintain relationships, eventually resentment appears. And resentment is often the emotional bill for boundaries that were never established. The integrated empath learns to pay attention before that bill arrives. They speak earlier, they say no earlier, they leave earlier, they communicate more directly. They don't wait until they are completely exhausted before acknowledging that something is wrong. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this phase is that the empath doesn't have to become hard to become strong. They don't need to lose their softness. They need to give their softness direction. A river is powerful because it has a channel. Without one, water spreads everywhere. The same is true of empathy. Your sensitivity becomes powerful when it has structure. Your compassion becomes sustainable when it has boundaries. Your intuition becomes useful when it is combined with discernment. And your heart becomes safer when you stop handing everyone the keys to it. That is the real destination, not becoming someone who feels nothing, becoming someone who feels deeply and still remains grounded, someone who can walk into chaos without becoming chaos, someone who can witness pain without making it their identity, someone who can love people without losing themselves inside those people. And when you reach that point, you finally understand the lesson hidden inside all three phases. The awakening taught you to notice. The breaking point taught you to protect. And integration teaches you how to live. You don't need a harder heart. You need stronger boundaries around the heart you already have. And once you reach that stage of integration, you begin to understand something that is easy to miss when you're still in survival mode. Your sensitivity was never actually the enemy. For years, an empath may look at their emotional depth and think, if the first could just stop caring so much, my life would be easier. And in some ways, that makes sense. When you feel everything intensely, disappointment can feel heavier. Betrayal can stay in your mind longer. Other people's moods can influence your own. You may wish you could simply switch the whole system off. But the goal was never to become less sensitive. The goal was to become more selective. Because sensitivity without discernment can become exhausting, but sensitivity combined with discernment becomes intelligence. That's an important distinction. Imagine having an extremely powerful radar, but no ability to interpret what the radar is detecting. You might notice everything, but you wouldn't know what deserves your attention. You would react to every signal as though it were an emergency. That's what happens when empathy exists without boundaries. You feel someone's sadness, and you assume you have to fix it. You sense someone's anger, and you assume you caused it. You recognize someone's insecurity, and you begin managing their emotions for them. You see someone's potential, and you become attached to the person they could become instead of accepting the person they consistently choose to be. And slowly your empathy stops being a way of understanding reality and becomes a way of avoiding reality. That is the hidden trap. Sometimes understanding someone too deeply can make it difficult to hold them accountable. You know their history, you know what happened to them, you know why they are afraid, you know where their behavior came from, and because you understand the explanation, you start minimizing the consequence. But psychology requires a more mature distinction. Explanation is not the same thing as justification. Someone can have a painful past and still be responsible for how they treat you. Someone can have abandonment wounds and still be responsible for how they communicate. Someone can be insecure and still be responsible for controlling behavior. Someone can have trauma and still need boundaries. Compassion does not require the removal of accountability. In fact, real compassion sometimes requires accountability because without it, you are not helping anyone grow. You are simply helping a pattern survive. This is where the mature empath begins to redefine what it means to be a good person. Being good does not mean being endlessly available. Being kind does not mean being endlessly agreeable. Being understanding does not mean accepting everything. And forgiveness does not mean giving someone unlimited access to your life. Those distinctions are liberating because they allow you to remain compassionate without becoming emotionally disposable. And there is another transformation that happens here. You begin separating what you know from what you assume. An empath may sense that someone is upset, but that doesn't automatically tell them why. You may notice distance, but you don't necessarily know what caused it. You may feel tension, but you cannot read another person's entire internal world with certainty. That humility is crucial because intuition can be useful, but intuition should not become a substitute for communication. The healthiest empath learns to say, I notice something feels different. Is everything okay? Instead of silently constructing an entire psychological story and then reacting to that story. That's emotional intelligence. Observation first, interpretation second, communication before conclusion. And once you develop that ability, your relationships become much more stable. You stop trying to read minds, you start asking questions, you stop predicting rejection, you start observing behavior, you stop measuring your worth through someone else's mood, and you stop treating every emotional shift around you as something you have to solve. This is also where the concept of emotional responsibility becomes extremely important. You are responsible for your words, your behavior, your choices, your boundaries, and the way you respond to other people. You are not responsible for regulating every adult around you. That doesn't make you uncaring. It makes you appropriately responsible. And there is a philosophical principle hidden inside that every human being has a territory of responsibility. When you constantly enter another person's emotional territory, you may believe you're helping them, but you're also taking away their opportunity to develop their own capacity. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is allow another person to experience the consequences of their choices. Let them be disappointed, let them be uncomfortable, let them solve their own problem, let them learn. You don't have to rescue someone from every emotion simply because you can feel it. And this is where sensitivity becomes a strength rather than a burden. You still notice, you still care, you still listen. But now you choose. You choose where your attention goes. You choose who receives your vulnerability. You choose which problems deserve your energy. You choose which relationships deserve continued investment. That is discernment. And discernment is what transforms empathy into wisdom. So don't make the mistake of believing that healing means becoming colder. The strongest empath isn't the person who feels nothing. It is the person who can feel deeply without surrendering their judgment. Your sensitivity can remain, your compassion can remain, your softness can remain, but they no longer control you. You control where they go. And once you learn that, you realize the thing you were trying to escape was never your sensitivity. You were never too sensitive. You simply needed to become more selective about what deserved your sensitivity. And eventually, after everything you've learned, everything you've lost, and everything you've had to confront within yourself, you reach the final transformation. You stop living as an emotional survivor and begin living as a self-aware empath. And there is a major difference between those two identities. An emotional survivor is constantly asking, how do I protect myself from what happened before? A self-aware empath asks, how do I build a life that reflects what I have learned? That is the difference between merely recovering and actually integrating the experience. Because healing is not simply about becoming less affected by people. It is about becoming more intentional about who you allow to affect you. At this stage, you no longer need to convince everyone that your heart is good. You don't need to prove that you're loyal. You don't need to demonstrate how much you can tolerate. You don't need to explain why you finally walked away. Something inside you has become quieter. And that quietness is not emptiness. It is certainty. You've learned that not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every person who leaves needs to be chased, and not every relationship that ends is a failure. Sometimes an ending is simply information. It tells you what the relationship was capable of becoming and what it was never capable of becoming. The self-aware empath understands this without turning bitter. That is one of the most important signs of genuine growth, because there is an immature version of healing that says, I have been hurt, therefore everyone is dangerous. But that's not healing. That's fear wearing the language of wisdom. Real healing says, I have been hurt, and now I know how to recognize what is healthy and what isn't. That is discernment, and discernment allows you to remain open without remaining naive. You can trust again without trusting everyone. You can love again without abandoning yourself. You can be vulnerable without giving away every part of yourself immediately. You begin understanding that trust should be built through consistent behavior, not demanded through words, and your standards change. You stop asking only whether you feel chemistry with someone. You start asking whether you feel safe around their character. You stop asking, do they need me? You ask, do they respect me? Nah. You stop asking, can I help this person? You ask, is this relationship mutually healthy? Those questions reveal something profound. You are no longer choosing relationships exclusively from emotional intensity. You're choosing them from consciousness. And that changes the kind of people you attract and the kind of people you tolerate. Because once you stop rewarding inconsistency with unlimited access, inconsistency becomes less attractive. Once you stop chasing emotionally unavailable people, their distance no longer feels like a challenge you need to solve. Once you stop confusing suffering with devotion, peaceful relationships stop feeling boring. You begin realizing that stability is not a lack of passion. Sometimes stability is what passion looks like when it is emotionally mature. And this is where the empath's greatest strength finally becomes visible. It was never simply the ability to feel other people. It was the ability to turn that awareness inward, to understand your own patterns, to recognize when you are overgiving, to notice when fear is disguising itself as love, to recognize when guilt is being used to manipulate you, to recognize when your desire to be needed is preventing you from being truly known. That level of self-awareness creates something far more powerful than emotional sensitivity. It creates choice. You can pause, you can observe, you can decide. And choice is the foundation of psychological freedom. Because when you are reactive, other people control your emotional environment. When you are conscious, you regain authority over your response. Someone can criticize you without defining you. Someone can reject you without determining your worth. Someone can misunderstand you without forcing you into endless explanations. Someone can leave without taking your identity with them. That is freedom. And perhaps the most surprising part is that the self-aware empath becomes less interested in being understood by everyone. They become more interested in understanding themselves. They know their values. They know their limits. They know what they will tolerate. They know what they will never repeat. And they understand that peace is not something another person gives you. Peace is something you protect through your choices. This doesn't mean you become emotionally detached from the world. Quite the opposite. You become capable of loving more deeply because your love is no longer fueled by fear. You help because you choose to help, not because you need to be needed. You give because you have something to give, not because you are terrified someone will leave if you stop giving. You forgive because you want freedom, not because you are afraid of confrontation. And you walk away when necessary without needing revenge. That is the final stage, not becoming harder, becoming clearer, not caring less, caring with wisdom, not closing your heart, learning who has earned a place inside it. So when you look back at the three phases, you can see the progression. First, you awaken to your sensitivity. Then you were forced to confront what happens when that sensitivity has no boundaries. And finally, you learned how to turn sensitivity into self-awareness. The awakening gave you perception. The breaking point gave you boundaries. And integration gave you peace. But now the responsibility is yours. You cannot control who hurt you. You cannot rewrite the past. You cannot force another person to understand your value. But you can decide what happens next. You can stop repeating the patterns that once exhausted you. You can stop abandoning yourself to keep other people comfortable. You can stop calling self-sacrifice love. And you can finally understand that your greatest transformation was never becoming someone who feels less. It was becoming someone who knows exactly what deserves to be felt, carried, protected, and released. Your greatest power is not feeling everything. It is finally choosing what gets access to you.